In the spring of 1860, a rider swung down from a lathered Mustang at a lonely station in the Nevada desert, knowing he had 10 minutes to eat before the mail was thrown across a fresh horse and he vanished into the night. What he swallowed in those minutes had to carry him 75 miles through hostile country, past alkali flats and freezing passes. Number 7 on this list was eaten one-handed at a gallop. Number 3 kept an entire empire of mail moving for 18 months. And number 1 was guarded like gold. These were not feasts, they were fuel, scraped together at the edge of the map, where a bad meal meant a slow horse, and a slow horse could mean death. Hit subscribe before we start. Let's count down, beginning with number 25. Number 25. Slumgullion was the meal riders dreaded most, a thin gray station stew that Mark Twain would later mock in his memoirs of Western travel. Cooked in a blackened kettle that never seemed to leave the fire, it was little more than boiling water, a fistful of salted meat, and whatever roots the station keeper could spare. At the poorest relay posts in the Nevada desert, the meat was gristle, and the broth tasted of wood smoke and alkali. Yet a hungry rider drank it down without complaint because the next station was hours away through the dark, and cold reluctance was a luxury the trail did not allow. Station keepers ladled it into tin cups, worn smooth by 100 hands. It filled the belly, warmed the blood, and asked nothing of the cook but a fire and the patience to keep the pot from scorching. Number 24. Cornmeal mush anchored the breakfast table at stations where flour ran short and the freight wagons were weeks overdue. The keeper stirred coarse yellow meal into salted boiling water, beating out the lumps with a wooden paddle until the pot thickened into a heavy porridge that clung to the spoon. Served steaming with a smear of bacon grease or a trickle of dark syrup, it was cheap, filling, and reliable in a country where reliability was rare. Riders spooned it down fast, knowing that mush left too long in the cup set into a stiff gray cake. Leftovers were never wasted. The cold slab was sliced and fried in a skillet the next morning, crisping at the edges into something almost like a treat. On the harshest mornings, mush was the difference between a rider who could climb into the saddle and one who could not. Number 23. Wild onions and prairie greens brought the only fresh flavor many stations ever saw. In the weeks after the snow melted, station keepers and off-duty riders walked the creek bottoms, gathering wild onion, dock, and lamb's quarters, the tender shoots that pushed up between the sage. Boiled soft with a scrap of pork or fried in a hot skillet, these greens broke the monotony of salt and starch that defined trail eating. More than flavor, they were medicine. The men of 1860 knew, if only by instinct, that a diet of bacon and biscuit left a body weak and the gums sore, and that anything green from the ground set it right. A rider who arrived pale and worn might be handed a plate of wilted greens without a word. The keepers understood that a season of nothing but cured meat wore a man down as surely as the miles. Number 22. Dried pea soup simmered at the back of the stove through the long, empty afternoons between riders. Split peas, hauled west by the sackful because they kept for months without spoiling, were dropped into water with a knuckle of salt pork and left to collapse into a thick green pottage. By dusk, when the pot had cooked down to a spoon-standing density, the station smelled of smoke and earth and something almost homelike. Riders coming off a hard leg valued it above almost anything because peas gave a slow, steady strength that carried a man through a night ride without the sudden hollow hunger that struck after lighter fare. The keeper topped the pot up rather than emptying it, adding water and peas day after day until the freight wagon brought more. That endless simmering pot was, in its way, the beating heart of a well-run station. Number 21, pickled cucumbers and pickled beets were the small, hoarded luxuries a good station keeper's wife guarded in stoneware crocks beneath the counter. Vinegar was precious and freight was dear, so a jar of pickles represented real forethought, packed in the settled towns of the East and hauled 1,000 miles by wagon. To a rider whose tongue had known nothing but salt and grease for a week, that first sharp, sour bite was almost a shock, a jolt of brightness that cut through the fat and woke the appetite. Pickles also did quiet work. No one spoke of aloud, settling a stomach turned by bad water and keeping a hard-worked body from breaking down. The best-run home stations, where riders slept and lingered longest, always seemed to have a crock going, and men remembered those stations warmly for years afterward. Number 20. Salt-rising bread filled the station with a strange, cheesy scent that newcomers never forgot. Made without any yeast to buy or store, it rose instead on a warm overnight ferment of cornmeal, milk, and salt, a temperamental process that failed as often as it worked. When the starter took, the dough puffed into dense white loaves with a tight crumb and a faintly sour tang, and the whole post ate well. When it failed, the batch went flat and sour, and everyone made do with hardtack. Station keepers learned to nurse the starter through cold nights, tucking the crock near the banked fire the way a shepherd guards a lamb. A fresh, warm slice, torn open and dragged through bacon grease, was one of the small mercies of trail life, and a rider lucky enough to reach a station on baking day counted himself blessed. Number 19. Hardtack was the meal of last resort, a plain flour and water biscuit baked so hard it could crack a tooth carelessly applied. It required no yeast, no skill, and almost no ingredients, which is exactly why it survived where everything else spoiled. Freighted west in wooden crates, it kept for months in the dry desert air, and every station held a reserve against the day the wagons failed to come. Riders soaked it in coffee or slumgullion to soften it enough to chew, or pounded it into crumbs to thicken a thin stew. Nobody praised hardtack. Nobody had to. It was insurance in biscuit form, the guarantee that no rider would ever face a 70-mile leg on a truly empty stomach. In the memory of the Old West, hardtack stands as the humble, unbreakable foundation beneath every more appealing thing a station ever served. Number 18. Sorghum molasses was the sweetness of the frontier, a dark, bittersweet syrup pressed from cane and hauled west in heavy jugs. Refined white sugar was a costly rarity out on the line, so molasses did the work of every sweet thing at once. It went over mush and flapjacks, into coffee, and by the spoonful straight to a rider who needed a fast surge of energy before a long ride. That sudden burst of sugar was no small thing to a man about to spend the next several hours fighting the cold in the dark, and keepers knew it. A jug of good sorghum was worth guarding. Its thick, smoky sweetness clung to the tin plate and the memory alike, and grown men who had ridden the line spoke of it fondly decades later, long after the last horse had been unsaddled. Number 17. Stewed dried apples turned a sack of leathery rings into something that tasted almost like home. Fresh fruit could not survive the journey west, but apples sliced and dried in the eastern orchards traveled beautifully, packed light and cheap in cloth sacks. The keeper soaked a handful overnight, then simmered them soft with a little sorghum until the kitchen filled with a sweet, faintly cidery steam that stopped riders in their tracks. Spooned over mush or folded into a rough pie crust when flour allowed, stewed apples were the closest thing to dessert most riders saw for months. That warm, sweet plate carried more than sugar. It carried a memory of settled places, of farmhouse kitchens and porches back east, a small taste of the world these young men had left behind to ride into the emptiness of the West. Number 16. Fresh-caught trout was the rare gift of the stations lucky enough to sit beside a cold mountain stream. In the high country of the Sierra and the Rockies, an off-duty rider or a resourceful keeper could pull silver trout from the runs with a line and a few minutes' patience, then lay them straight into a skillet, spitting with bacon fat. The flesh cooked pink and flaked apart at the touch of a fork, tasting of clean water and open air, a world away from the salt-cured monotony of the desert posts. Riders who worked the mountain divisions bragged about their trout the way desert riders complained about their slumgullion. A hot, fried trout after a brutal climb over the pass was a reward a man remembered, and for a few brief minutes, the danger waiting in the dark could almost be forgotten. Number 15. Jackrabbit stew stretched the endless supply of desert hares into a hearty pot that fed a whole station. Jackrabbits swarmed the sagebrush flats, and a keeper handy with a rifle rarely wanted for meat. The lean, gamey flesh was tough and needed hours of slow simmering with onion and whatever roots were on hand before it surrendered and fell from the bone. But time was the one thing a station keeper had plenty of between riders, so the pot bubbled all afternoon until the broth turned rich and the meat grew tender. A rider swinging down at dusk could count on a ladle of hot stew and a hunk of bread to line his stomach before the night leg. It was free meat from a hard land, and on the desert stations where the freight ran thin, jackrabbit stew often stood between the men and real hunger. Number 14. Sage hen graced the table when a keeper's aim was true, and the birds were plentiful in the brush. The sage grouse, a large ground bird that fed on the bitter sagebrush, carried a strong, peppery flavor in its dark meat that some riders loved and others could barely stomach. Roasted over the fire or jointed and fried, it was fresh wild game in a country starved for anything but salt pork, and a welcome change no matter how it tasted. The knowing keepers soaked the meat in salted water first to draw out the sharpest of the sage tang before it ever reached the skillet. A plate of hot sage hen meant the station had a good hunter, and a good hunter meant the men there ate better than most on the line. In the lore of the trail, wild game like this marked the difference between a station that merely survived and one that lived well. Number 13. Buffalo, meat, fresh or dried, was the great prize of the eastern divisions where the herds still darkened the plains. When hunters brought in a kill, a station feasted on rich, dark hump meat and marrow bones, the finest eating the frontier had to offer, grilled fast over hot coals and served dripping. What could not be eaten at once was cut into thin strips and dried in the wind and sun into a hard, dark jerky that kept for months and weighed almost nothing. That dried buffalo became saddle food, tucked into a rider's coat to gnaw on across the miles. Pattern break here, because this is where the danger sharpens. The same herds that fed the stations drew the hunters, and the conflict that made this trail so perilous. And a rider carrying buffalo jerky was often riding through the very country where the herds and the trouble ran thickest. Number 12. Pronghorn antelope steak was the desert's answer to beef, a lean red meat from the swift animals that bounded across the sage flats. Because pronghorn carried almost no fat, the meat cooked fast and turned tough and dry if a careless hand left it too long in the pan. So the good cook seared it hot and pulled it quick, then draped it in bacon grease to make up for what the animal lacked. A rider handed a plate of fresh antelope steak, ate like a king by trail standards, filling up on real red meat instead of cured pork for once. Pronghorn were hard to hunt, faster than any horse and wary of men, so a steak on the plate meant a keeper who could shoot and shoot well. In the dry heart of the root, where a garden would not grow, wild meat like this was survival dressed up as a feast. Number 11. Corn dodgers were the hard-baked cousins of cornbread, small, dense ovals of cornmeal, salt, and water that a keeper could bake fast on a hot skillet or the blade of a hoe over the coals. They needed no yeast and no fussing, which made them perfect for a station where riders arrived unannounced and hungry. Crisp and browned on the outside, coarse and heavy within, a dodger could be split and stuffed with bacon or sopped in gravy, and it held together in a saddlebag better than any soft bread. Riders carried them for the road, gnawing at the tough crust between stations when the hunger came on. They were plain to the point of severity, but they were dependable, and dependability was worth more than delicacy on a trail where the next meal was always uncertain and always miles away. Number 10. Fried potatoes were the pride of the stations that managed to coax a garden from the stubborn ground. Where a keeper had water and the will to work it, a patch of potatoes meant a luxury the desert posts could only dream of. Sliced thick and fried golden in bacon grease until the edges crisped and curled, they turned a plain plate of salt pork into a proper meal. Riders coming off the barren stretches where nothing grew and every scrap was hauled by wagon savored fried potatoes as proof that civilization had a foothold even out here. The keepers guarded their gardens against the frost and the wandering stock, because a good potato crop lifted the whole station's fare for a season. A hot skillet of crisp fried potatoes was the taste of a station run by someone who cared, and riders remembered which stations those were. Number 9. Flapjacks with molasses were the breakfast riders dreamed about on the cold end of a night leg. The keeper stirred flour or cornmeal into a loose batter, spooned it onto a griddle spitting with grease, and flipped out stacks of hotcakes browned and steaming. Drowned in dark sorghum syrup, they delivered exactly what a spent rider needed: a fast rush of warmth and sugar and heavy fuel to face the day. On a bitter mountain morning, a plate of flapjacks was worth more than money. The batter could be stretched thin to feed many, or piled thick for a man who had ridden all night, and the griddle was rarely cold at a busy home station. That sizzle and the smell of scorching syrup were among the few pure comforts the trail offered, and a rider knew he had reached a good station the moment he caught the scent from the door. Number 8. Fried eggs were the true mark of a home station, the larger posts where riders slept and rested between assignments. Only a station settled enough to keep a few hens could offer eggs, and hens meant permanence, a garden, a well, a keeper who intended to stay. A rider who had lived for weeks on cured meat and hard bread out on the relay line could weep at the sight of 2 eggs fried in bacon grease, the yolk soft and gold, sliding across a tin plate. Eggs were fragile and rare and could not travel, so they never reached the lonely desert relays where riders only changed horses and rode on. They belonged to the home stations, to the places of rest, and they came to stand for exactly that: a warm plate, a bed, a night off the trail before the dark road called again. Number 7. Dried beef jerky was the only meal a rider ever ate in the saddle, and the most important for it. Strips of beef or wild game, salted hard and dried until they were nearly black, kept for months, and weighed next to nothing, which made them perfect for the road. A rider tucked a fistful into his coat before pushing off into the dark, and on the longest legs, when no station stood between him and the miles, he tore at that leathery jerky one-handed at a full gallop, chewing as the country blurred past. It was tough, intensely salty, and endless work to eat, but it kept a man moving when stopping was not an option. This was food reduced to its purest purpose: no comfort, no pleasure, only the raw fuel to carry a body and the mail through country where a halt could cost a life. Number 6. Sawmill gravy poured over biscuits was the frontier's great alchemy, turning almost nothing into a meal that stuck to the ribs. The keeper stirred a spoonful of flour into a skillet of bacon grease, cooked it to a nutty brown, then whisked in water or milk until it thickened into a thick, peppery, off-white gravy. Ladled generous over split biscuits or corn dodgers, it made a filling, comforting plate from the cheapest scraps in the station. Nothing was wasted. The very grease left behind by the morning's bacon became the base of the gravy, feeding a rider on the memory of meat. This was thrift, raised to an art. the kind of resourcefulness that defined every good cook on the line. A plate of biscuits and gravy sent a rider off warm and heavy, and it cost the station barely a thing beyond the flour. Number 5. Sourdough biscuits were the daily bread of the trail, risen not from bought yeast, but from a living starter the keeper guarded like a member of the family. That crock of bubbling, sour-smelling batter was carried west, protected from freezing, fed with flour and water, and passed from station to station like an heirloom. From it came biscuits with a tangy bite and a tender crumb, baked fresh in a Dutch oven, buried in coals, until the tops browned golden. A rider could split a hot sourdough biscuit, lay a slab of bacon inside, and carry it into the dark to eat one-handed on the road. Some starters were said to be years old, tended across 1,000 miles of trail. The sourdough biscuit was more than food. It was continuity, a warm thread of home, baked fresh every day at the edge of the wilderness. Number 4. Cornbread and corn pone fed the line when wheat flour ran short, which on the far divisions was often. Cornmeal was cheaper than flour and traveled better, and it became the backbone of station baking across the route. Mixed with water, salt, and a little grease, it was poured into a hot, greased skillet and baked until a crust formed, and the middle set golden and dense. Corn pone, the simplest form, was little more than meal and water shaped by hand and baked hard, plain but dependable. Warm from the pan, cornbread sopped up gravy and pot liquor and gave a rider real weight in his stomach. Cold and firm, it slipped into a saddlebag for the road. In a country where wheat was a luxury, freighted from far away, humble corn kept the riders fed and the mail moving through the loneliest stretches of the West. Number 3. Salt pork and bacon were the meat that built the Pony Express, the single food that appeared at nearly every station on the entire route. Cured hard with salt so it would keep for months without spoiling in the desert heat, it survived the long haul by freight wagon where fresh meat never could. Fried into crisp strips, boiled soft in beans and stew, or rendered down for the grease that cooked everything else, salt pork was the one constant a rider could count on from Missouri to California. Its grease fried the potatoes, thickened the gravy, and greased the griddle. Its meat filled the stew pot and the biscuit. Pattern break, because here is the truth of it. Without this one salt-cured, freight-proof meat, there simply was no way to feed men across 1,900 miles of wilderness. Bacon did not just flavor the trail, bacon made the trail possible. Number 2, boiled beans were the meal that never left the stove, the humble pot that fed the Pony Express day after day without fail. Dried beans, hauled west by the sackful, kept forever, and cooked into a filling, sustaining pot with nothing more than water, salt, and a knuckle of pork. But beans demanded time. They simmered for hours over a low fire, the keeper topping up the water and stirring now and then until the pot turned thick and the beans grew soft and creamy. A rider arriving hungry could always count on beans, ladled hot over cornbread with a strip of bacon laid across the top. That slow, steady fuel carried a man through the longest, coldest legs without failing. Cheap, endless, and utterly reliable, the bean pot was the quiet engine of the whole line, asking only patience and giving back exactly what a rider needed to survive. And finally, number 1, coffee crowned every Pony Express station as the single most vital thing a rider swallowed before racing into the dark. Boiled black and brutally strong in a battered pot that lived on the fire, it was less a drink than a tool, the one reliable weapon a rider had against exhaustion, cold, and the crushing weight of the miles ahead. Green beans were roasted and ground fresh at the station, then boiled hard until the brew turned nearly to tar, bitter enough to snap a man awake in an instant. A rider coming off a night leg drank it to steady his hands. A rider heading out drank it to face what waited in the black hours ahead. It warmed him, woke him, and steeled him for a ride where falling asleep in the saddle could mean falling to his death. Stations guarded their coffee supply above almost anything else because everyone on the line understood a simple truth. Beans could be stretched and bacon rationed, but a rider without coffee was a rider who might not make it through the night. That scalding tin cup, gulped in the last minute before the mail was thrown across a fresh horse, was the final act at every station, the taste on a young rider's tongue as he spurred out of the light and into the waiting dark. Across all 25 meals, from the dreaded slumgullion to the sacred cup of coffee, these station foods tell a story of grit, thrift, and survival at the raw edge of the American West. They were not chosen for flavor, but for endurance, foods that could be salted, dried, and hauled across a wilderness to keep a chain of young riders and the mail moving through country that gave nothing freely. Behind every plate stood a keeper who coaxed a garden from stubborn ground, guarded a sourdough starter through freezing nights, or kept a bean pot simmering for the next hungry man to swing down from a lathered horse. These were the last tastes of warmth and light before a rider vanished into the dark, and they carried him on. Which one would have fueled you into the night? Tell me in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe.